You know the saying, the show must go on. Well, Frank Sinatra lived that motto every single day of his life. But behind those piercing blue eyes and that legendary voice was a man carrying secrets so heavy they nearly broke him. We're talking about pain, betrayal, and a darkness that even his closest friends never fully understood. Tonight, we're going to uncover the private torment that haunted one of America's greatest entertainers. The real story behind the chairman of the board will shock you. Picture this: a man who could command any room, seduce any audience, and make grown men weep with a single note. Yet when the curtains fell and the applause died down, Frank Sinatra was often alone with demons that no amount of fame or fortune could silence. What I'm about to reveal goes beyond the tabloid headlines and the gossip columns. This is about the human being behind the icon, the vulnerable soul beneath the swagger. Growing up in Hoboken, New Jersey, Francis Albert Sinatra learned early that survival meant putting on a performance. His father, Anthony, was a quiet man who worked as a firefighter and ran a tavern. His mother, Natalie, was the real force in the family, a woman who demanded perfection and never let young Frank forget that mediocrity wasn't an option. But here's what most people don't know. That drive for excellence came with a price that would haunt Sinatra for decades. Even as a child, Frank felt the weight of expectations crushing down on him. His mother's relentless pursuit of success created a pattern that would define his entire life. He learned to bury his insecurities beneath bravado, to mask his pain with charm, and to never let anyone see him sweat. But the cracks were already forming, and those cracks would eventually become chasms that threatened to swallow him whole. The young Sinatra discovered music as both his salvation and his prison. When he sang, the world made sense. The chaos in his head quieted down, and for those precious moments, he felt whole. But with that gift came an obsession that bordered on madness. He wasn't just pursuing a career. He was chasing something deeper, something that always seemed just out of reach. Every note had to be perfect, every performance had to transcend the last, and failure wasn't just disappointing, it was devastating. By the time Frank hit the big time with Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, he had already developed the habits that would both make and break him. The perfectionism that drove him to greatness also made him impossible to work with at times. The charm that won over audiences masked a deep-seated fear of abandonment that would sabotage his closest relationships. And the confidence that made him a star was really just a carefully constructed wall protecting a heart that had been broken too many times to count. The pain wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Frank's relationship with his father was complicated, marked by long silences and unspoken disappointments. Anthony Sinatra was a good man, but he couldn't understand his son's artistic temperament or his relentless ambition. The distance between them grew wider as Frank's star rose higher, creating a wound that never fully healed. Years later, even at the height of his fame, Sinatra would still crave his father's approval, still feel like that scrappy kid from Hoboken trying to prove himself worthy of love. But the real devastation came from his relationships with women. Frank Sinatra was a man who fell hard and fast, who loved with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. His first marriage to Nancy Barbado seemed like a fairy tale from the outside, the hometown sweetheart who stood by her man through thick and thin. But the reality was far more complex and painful than anyone imagined. Nancy wasn't just a wife. She was Frank's anchor, his connection to the world he'd left behind in Hoboken. She represented stability, family, and the simple life he sometimes longed for, but could never fully embrace. The guilt over what he put her through would eat at him for the rest of his life. He loved her in a way that was pure and uncomplicated, but he also resented the limitations that love seemed to impose on him. It was a contradiction that tore him apart from the inside. When fame came calling, it brought temptations that Frank wasn't strong enough to resist. The attention from other women was intoxicating, a validation that fed his ego and temporarily filled the emptiness inside him. But each betrayal of Nancy's trust carved another piece out of his soul. He knew he was destroying the one pure thing in his life, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. The pattern was set. He would hurt the people he loved most, then spend years trying to make up for it. The breaking point came when he met Ava Gardner. If Nancy was his anchor, Ava was his hurricane, a force of nature that swept him off his feet and left destruction in her wake. Their relationship wasn't just passionate. It was volcanic, explosive, and ultimately toxic for both of them. But Frank couldn't resist the pull, even though he knew it would cost him everything he'd worked for. The decision to leave Nancy for Ava wasn't just about following his heart. It was about choosing chaos over stability, excitement over security, and passion over peace. It was a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The public scandal that followed was brutal, but the private pain was even worse. Frank had destroyed his family, disappointed his children, and broken the heart of the only woman who had ever loved him unconditionally. But Ava came with her own set of demons, her own capacity for cruelty that matched Frank's intensity. She could build him up with a glance and destroy him with a word. Their fights were legendary, their reconciliations passionate, and their eventual separation inevitable. What's rejection cut into Frank's already wound people didn't see was how deeply Ava's psyche. She made him feel alive in ways he'd never experienced. But she also made him question everything about himself. The professional toll was immediate and devastating. The same public that had once worshipped him now turned against him. His records stopped selling, his movies flopped, and his concert bookings dried up. For a man whose identity was so tied to his success, this fall from grace was more than a career setback. It was an existential crisis that brought him to the edge of despair. There were nights when Frank sat alone in his empty apartment, wondering if it had all been worth it. The loneliness was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that he had brought it all on himself. He'd had everything: fame, fortune, a loving family, and he'd thrown it away for a woman who couldn't or wouldn't love him the way he needed to be loved. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who could make millions of people feel less alone had never felt more isolated in his life. But this was just the beginning of Frank's descent into darkness. What happened next would test every fiber of his being and force him to confront truths about himself that he'd spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The comeback everyone talks about, that triumphant return with "from here to eternity," came at a cost that few people understood. And the shadows that followed him through those golden years of the 1950s and 1960s were darker than anyone imagined. The real tragedy wasn't just what Frank lost, it was what he could never seem to find. Despite all the accolades, all the awards, and all the adoration, there was always something missing, some piece of himself that remained forever out of reach. The entertainment industry has always been unforgiving, but what happened to Frank Sinatra in the early 1950s was nothing short of a public execution. The same reporters who once hung on his every word now sharpened their knives, ready to carve up what remained of his reputation. But the real pain wasn't coming from the headlines, it was coming from the silence. The phone calls that stopped coming, the friends who suddenly became too busy to return his messages, and the hollow echo of his own voice in recording studios that no longer wanted him. Frank's voice, that instrument that had carried him from the streets of Hoboken to the pinnacle of stardom, began to betray him in ways that terrified him to his core. The hemorrhaging on his vocal cords wasn't just a medical condition. It was a manifestation of the internal bleeding that had been going on for years. Every note that cracked was a piece of his soul breaking. Every missed high note, a reminder of everything he'd lost. The doctors told him he might never sing again. And for Frank Sinatra, that wasn't just a career death sentence. It was a spiritual one. During those dark months, Frank would sit at his piano in the middle of the night, running his fingers over the keys but afraid to open his mouth. The silence in those moments was deafening, filled with the ghosts of songs he might never sing again and dreams that seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. The man who had once commanded stages across the world was now afraid of his own voice, terrified that what came out would be a shadow of what once was. But perhaps even more crushing than the professional humiliation was the personal isolation that followed. Frank had always surrounded himself with people. The Rat Pack hadn't formed yet, but he'd always had his crew, his entourage, his hangers-on. Now, in his darkest hour, he discovered who his real friends were, and the list was shorter than he'd hoped. The fair-weather friends disappeared faster than his record sales, leaving him to confront his demons alone. Ava wasn't making things easier. Their relationship had become a battlefield where love and hate danced so closely together that neither could tell where one ended and the other began. She would call him in the middle of the night from some exotic location, her voice thick with whatever she'd been drinking, and they'd fight about everything and nothing. Then she'd hang up, leaving him staring at the phone, wondering if he'd ever hear from her again. The uncertainty was killing him slowly, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away. The suicide attempt that few people talk about happened during this period. Frank never spoke about it publicly, and his family buried the details so deep that even his closest biographers could only speculate. But those who knew him best saw the signs: the weight loss, the sleepless nights, the way he'd stare into space as if he was looking for something that wasn't there. The official story was exhaustion and stress, but the people who loved him knew it was something much darker. That night in his apartment, when he sat with a bottle of pills in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other, Frank Sinatra came face to face with the man he'd become. Stripped of his fame, his voice uncertain, his love life in shambles, he had to decide whether Francis Albert Sinatra was worth saving. The fact that he made it through that night would become the foundation of everything that came after, but the scars from that moment would never fully fade. What pulled him back from the brink wasn't hope. It was rage. Pure, undiluted fury at everyone who had written him off, everyone who had counted him out, everyone who thought they'd seen the last of Frank Sinatra. That anger became fuel, and he channeled it into the most important audition of his life. When he walked into that screen test for From Here to Eternity, he wasn't just reading for a part. He was fighting for his life. The role of Maggio in From Here to Eternity wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection. But what most people don't understand is how perfectly that character matched Frank's own pain. Maggio was a scrappy underdog, a guy who got beaten down but refused to stay down. Someone who understood that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. When Frank delivered those lines, he wasn't acting. He was bleeding truth onto the screen. But even success couldn't heal all the wounds. The Academy Award that came with that performance should have been the ultimate validation, the proof that he'd clawed his way back to the top. Instead, it felt hollow, like a consolation prize for suffering he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. The applause that night felt different somehow, tinged with pity rather than pure admiration. He'd won, but at what cost? The real tragedy was that Frank's greatest artistic achievements came from his deepest pain. The albums he recorded in the late 1950s, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, In the Wee Small Hours, Only the Lonely, were masterpieces born from heartbreak. Every note carried the weight of his experiences. Every word was soaked in the tears he'd shed in private. He'd learned to transform his suffering into art, but that meant he could never fully heal from it. His relationship with his children became another source of profound guilt. Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., and Tina watched their father become a stranger, someone whose pain made him unpredictable and sometimes cruel. He loved them fiercely, but his own damaged heart made it difficult for him to show that love in healthy ways. The patterns he'd learned in his own childhood, the emotional distance, the unrealistic expectations, the inability to express vulnerability, were being passed down to another generation, and Frank was powerless to stop it. The formation of the Rat Pack in the early 1960s looked like the ultimate triumph from the outside. Frank, surrounded by talented friends, living the high life in Las Vegas, appearing to have conquered the world. But for those who looked closer, it was clear that Frank was still running from something. The constant parties, the all-night drinking sessions, the endless parade of women, it all served to fill the void that no amount of success seemed to touch. Dean Martin became perhaps the closest thing Frank ever had to a brother. But even that relationship was complicated by Frank's need to be the leader, the one in control. Dean's laid-back attitude was both a blessing and a curse for Frank. It provided the stability he craved, but it also highlighted his own inability to simply relax and be content. Watching Dean navigate life with such apparent ease only reminded Frank of his own internal struggles. The nights grew longer as Frank aged, and with them came a different kind of loneliness, one that fame couldn't cure and money couldn't buy. The man who had once believed that success would fill every empty space inside him discovered that some voids only grow deeper with time. His later marriages to Mia Farrow and Barbara Marx were attempts to recapture something he'd lost long ago. But you can't go back to innocence once it's gone. In his final years, when the voice that had defined him began to falter and the spotlight started to dim, Frank Sinatra was forced to confront the most painful truth of all, that he'd spent a lifetime performing for everyone except himself. The private pain that had driven him to greatness had also prevented him from ever finding the peace he desperately sought. The tragedy of Frank Sinatra wasn't that he suffered, it was that he suffered alone, even when surrounded by thousands of adoring fans. Behind every perfect note was a broken man trying to sing his way to salvation, never quite reaching the harmony he craved most. His story reminds us that sometimes our greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest wounds, and that even legends bleed in the darkness when no one's watching. Frank Sinatra gave us the soundtrack to our dreams and heartbreaks, but he paid for it with pieces of his soul that he could never get back. The show did go on, just like he always said it would, but the man behind the curtain remained forever searching for something that stayed just out of reach.